Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for what's going to be a really fantastic conversation here. We're going to be discussing a new book that has come out on the field of youth mentoring, and it's really full of some compelling ideas and some interesting new paths forward for the youth mentoring movement. So we thank everyone for taking some time out of your busy day today and joining us. So good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. Good morning to those of us like me still out here on the smoky West Coast. Thank you for joining us today. I am Mike Geringer, Director of Research and Evaluation at Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. And we are joined today by our special guest. And the topic of discussion today will be Dr. Jean Rhodes, who is the Frank L. Boyden Professor of Psychology at UMass Boston, and the principal investigator and all-around leader of the Center for Evidence-Based Mentoring, housed there at the university. Those of you that know Jean's work, Jean's one of the leading scholars in our field, has been really studying mentoring and relationships for a couple decades now, and has written an awesome new book that we'll be talking about today. So I'm very excited for this conversation. Just a few housekeeping things, because I know folks always want to know some things right at the very beginning of these events. You will have plenty of opportunity throughout this to ask questions of Jean about her book and the ideas in it. You can do that by typing your questions into the question panel, which you can find in the little GoToWebinar dashboard here somewhere on your screen. I think it pops up most often on the right-hand side. Just type your questions in there, and then my wonderful colleague Minnie Chen out of our Boston office will be kind of going through those and asking kind of the most pertinent ones. Folks are asking similar questions en masse. We'll definitely start with those first, but we hope to get through every question that folks ask today. We got plenty of time scheduled for that, so don't be shy about sending in your thoughts and your questions. And I see a few of you have already done that in the panel, so thanks for doing that. We will be making a recording of this available after the event here a little bit later in the week. We got to get it up on Mentor's YouTube channel, but the recording will be made available, and if it's okay with Jean, we'll also be making a copy of these slides available so that you can peruse them further and think about them or discuss them with other colleagues that were unable to join us today. And I apologize for the landscaping sounds happening outside my window. These are the perils of doing these things from working at home during this pandemic, but hopefully the background noise here will be at a minimum shortly. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about this really interesting and thoughtful new book that Dr. Rhodes has written, and talking mostly about the themes that are in it. And it really covers kind of the history of mentoring in America. And Jean, you go way back to the origins of it well over a century ago, and talk about how that's influenced all the way up through the decades to where we're at today. And you do that as a way of setting up what I think is a really important discussion about the effectiveness of mentoring programs. And here we're really talking about formal programs, right? We're not talking about natural relationships necessarily. We're talking about kind of the results of these programmatic efforts to provide mentors to young people for a variety of reasons. And Jean does a great job in the book of kind of talking about models and approaches to mentoring that research suggests are most effective, and really uses that as a springboard to talk about potential paths forward for mentoring programs that may increase their impact by kind of subtly changing the way and the position of volunteer mentors and how they work with young people and the context in which they do that. So obviously we want to hear from you all with questions about how these ideas connect to your own work and your own programs. And you know, I'll be asking Jean a few additional questions a little bit later in the webinar to kind of dive even deeper into some of her findings and some of her recommendations for the field. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Rhodes here to give us the scoop on what Older and Wiser is all about. So go ahead and take it away, Jean.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate you're inviting me to give this webinar, and I appreciate everybody who's giving up time during their workday to hear the new ideas that I put forth in this book. This book is a follow-up to a book that I wrote maybe 15 years ago called Older and Wiser. And I thought it would be pretty easy. Never think that a book is going to be easy. That's my first bit of advice. Because when Harvard Press came back and said, do you want to write an update? I thought, oh, that'll be, simple, because I've been so immersed in the field because of the Chronicle of Evidence-Based Mentoring, which is a newsletter I put out with lots of summaries of research. So I'm really up on the research. I thought I'll just grab some of those columns and have at it. But it was a lot more than that. It took several years to write, and it really led me to rethink mentoring. So you can go to the next slide. I also want to thank Mentor, not only for hosting this, but for all of the support that they have given to the Center for Evidence-Based Mentoring and to the field over the many years they've been around, 30 years now. So this is the book. Some of you may recognize it. Some of you may not have been born when it was written, somewhere in between. This is a book that I laid out kind of the field, because when I first graduated from my doctoral program in clinical psych, there really wasn't much of a field of youth mentoring. So I began by just taking a look at what literature was there and coming to the conclusions that, mentoring needed to be a certain way, which I then re-evaluated several years later. So the next slide. And it turned into this book. So the first thing I asked, well, Mike was right. I start with, some of the history of youth mentoring, which I found fascinating. And to gather that history, I actually had to listen to primary tapes of one of the founders of the field. He started the first Big Brothers Big Sisters chapter in Cleveland. I had to go to a library in New York City and listen to cassette tapes and hear him talk about it. And the essential model that he came up with, which I described, hasn't really changed that much in really a century of, the idea that, a good relationship with a caring adult can just make a world of difference. And so he started with his relationship with a boy he saw picking through his garbage. His name was Irvin Westheimer, and it really blossomed into Big Brothers and eventually Big Sisters and eventually the field of youth mentoring. And my question was, does it make a difference? How do these models, the most common models of youth mentoring, affect youth? And so I started that by looking at what are called meta-analyses. And a meta-analysis is when you take all of the studies in a field and you put them together and you look at the overall what's called the effect size, which is really just basically the difference between the control group or the comparison group and the group that got mentoring. And you can do this with anything. In this case, it was mentoring. And I just tracked them since the beginning, since David Dubois did the first meta-analysis in 2002 through present. So you can go to the next slide. And when we look at the effect size, as I said, it's the difference between the treatment or comparison group and the group that got a mentor. And there's no easy conventions, but just bear these numbers in mind that generally, 0.20 is considered a small effect, and then 0.50 is a medium, and then it gets up from there. And, you see interventions with these kinds of effects. And so I wanted to see, well, we've made a lot of investment in mentoring programs, in mentoring research and development over the past 2 decades. How has that affected this overall effect size? And what I saw as I began to plot this out is, these are the meta-analyses, the years that they were published. And we see that over almost 20 years, the effect size of youth mentoring programs has not really budged much, despite, pretty serious investments in federal spending in terms of hundreds of millions of dollars, in terms of articles. So back in, 2002, there were only about 5,000 articles or less. And what we see is not much of a change. And so that was really kind of an eye-opener for me. And so it took me down a path for the next few chapters to try to figure out why. You can look at some of the usual suspects. Well, mentors are dropping out or this or that, but I really wanted to do a deep dive, and that's what I did. And that's why this book took so long. So I could kind of walk you through all of them. There's a chapter that does, but I'm just going to focus on what I thought is kind of the largest reason if you want to go to the next slide. And that is that I think the field of mentoring got swept up into the field of positive youth development, and maybe a little too much. The field of mentoring, the most recent round of programs emerged during this big movement toward really focusing on young people's assets and strengths, which is great. But what that, and we kind of got lumped with other programs like after school programs or even sports programs and recreational programs. Mentoring kind of fit in there, but really mentoring is quite different. It's really a one-on-one relationship. And I think in lumping it with those programs and taking on the language and the vocabulary, but not necessarily the rigor of the field of positive youth development, we kind of overlook the fact that many of the young people who are referred to programs are at increasingly high risk and are struggling with some serious issues. Now, this is a study that was done by Roger Jajora, Carla Herrera, and others, Tom Keller, where they looked at 30 what they called business as usual mentoring programs. And that was a lot of programs across the whole United States, over 2,000 matches it represented. And they, this was just one of the part of the report. They just told, reported what percentage of the kids in these mentoring programs were in extreme poverty and had a single parent and so forth. And what we did in my lab at the center was compare that to national averages. And what you see is that the average young person who was referred to a youth mentoring program is at roughly double the risk, is roughly struggling twice as much as the average American youth overall. You see this particularly with mental health challenges. Almost 50%, the reason for referral at baseline was that their parents and they saw that they had a mental health challenge. They're also struggling with ADHD. And, you can understand why when you look at these contextual risk factors. And it led me to realize that in many cases, parents are, and, teachers are seeing mentoring programs as potentially an alternative to professional care, an alternative to psychotherapy. In fact, a study that was done by some colleagues out at University of New Mexico showed that basically, particularly parents of color are far more likely to see a mentoring program as the necessary response to their child having mental health problems. As their child's mental health problems go up, they're twice as likely as white parents to think, oh, my child needs a mentoring program. And in a study that was done by Tim Cavell, Lindsay Wheeler, and others at Big Brothers Big Sisters, they found that in 25% of the cases, if you ask the parents, why did you refer your child to this mentoring program? They said because of a significant mental health concern. So you can go to the next slide. And so what I realized, this is comes out of basically the National Academy of Sciences. They look at prevention programs on this continuum, and promotion would be things like everybody does, like, putting fluoride in the drinking water type things. But from there, it's like universal programs, this is a good program for any kid, to selective, to indicated, to more treatment oriented programs. And I think partly because we've got lumped with positive youth development, but partly because we were underestimating the risk, we often lumped mentoring programs in a more universal, and really when in fact we were dealing with subgroups that were at much higher risk and actually showing early struggles. And so I think that's where youth mentoring program really is. And because of that, I think that our models, as wonderful as many of them are, and I certainly have been an advocate of many of them, they just weren't strong enough and specific enough and tailored enough to the serious concerns that young people were facing as they got referred to mentoring programs. And I could show you lots of data, and in the book I do, but this is a new study that just recently came out with my doctoral students and Liz Raposa, where we found that compared to programs that kind of take a non-specific approach, and what I mean by that is they're trying to treat lots of different kids, kind of like a Big Brothers Big Sisters type programs. They're not like a STEM for girls. They're a very non-specific program, and because of that, they can't really be very specific in their treatment. Compared to those, when you compare them with targeted programs, you see that targeted programs are twice as effective as these more non-specific friendship-oriented programs, where the main goal is just to form a bond. And really 3 times more effective if you want to hit particular outcomes like academic outcomes or mental health or social functioning. It's the programs that target those things that are getting these much stronger effects. And in fact, I'll just tell you, because I tried to reduce the number of charts, but now I'm talking about one, that in general, programs like Big Brothers Big Sisters and many of the most common ones that kind of accept all young people and are really focused on forming friendships and bonds and are less target oriented, are getting effects around like 0.07, 0.06, which is really not, that's closer to zero. And, you know, if it was a medical clinical trial, we would be looking for an alternative. And so I thought, well, we know what the alternative is. The alternative is to provide targeted, evidence-based care that really zeroes in on what the young person is struggling with. So this really goes back to what Tim Cavell noted in a kind of a famous among researchers chapter in 2005 of, or maybe it was 2012 of Dubois and Karcher's Handbook of Youth Mentoring. They said we need to move from thinking of the relationship as the intervention to the relationship as a context for targeted evidence-based intervention. And our data certainly support that. And I would say that's great, but it's impractical in some ways, because you can only provide targeted care if if the group that you're targeting is all kind of dealing with the same struggle. So for example, a boutique program can focus in, like Tim Cavell has the luxury, he only opens his program to kids who are being bullied. And so his cafeteria program is perfect because they can really go deep into it, the same way a boutique can go very deep into the selection. But how does a big program where one kid may be struggling with academic issues, one kid is struggling with you know, friendship issues, the next one is having mental health issues, how do they provide targeted care for every single person? And you'll notice I used a target because I actually believe that that can happen, but it took some thinking to think about how we do that. So I hope by now, I didn't give you as much data as I typically do because I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, but I hope by now I've convinced you that we're going to get stronger effects when we move beyond just providing sort of a generic kind of friendship or providing things kind of haphazardly to all kids when only some of them might benefit, or not giving the right dosage, that when we need to get more serious and really provide evidence-based care that really matches the challenges that young people are facing, in addition to forming a relationship. So here's kind of what I came up with. This was my solution from writing the book. And if you'll go to the next slide, I just want to break this down. So what I would say is that every program in, you know, no matter what you're doing, should be doing the same thing, which is recruiting, screening, training good, caring people to work with other people, to supervise them, you know, work with the parents and caregivers and teachers, provide assessment, and I would say teach the volunteers how to form strong bonds, because that is universal. But then once you get past that, I really think that there's 4 different ways that you can do youth mentoring that could be effective. And we'll start with the more, you know, the boutiques, the shoe boutique, if you will. In those smaller programs should continue to do what they do, which is train their mentors to deliver targeted evidence-based intervention. You see this with Sam McQuillan's program, you see this with some of the best programs. And the mentor's role is to deliver the intervention. But what I really argued, and I talked to many, many programs, is it's hard to teach the typical untrained volunteer to deliver interventions with any kind of fidelity when you've got a larger program and you're dealing with so many different potentially needed interventions. You know, it's unrealistic to expect a program would have a library of every type of evidence-based intervention that comes their way and have the staff and training to deliver and supervise it with the rigor that some of these smaller programs that are incubated at universities are able to do. And that maybe we shouldn't even be asking mentors to deliver complicated interventions, because the further you get from how it was intended when it was developed, the less fidelity, the lower the effects anyway. So that led me to other alternatives. And I would say in larger sort of relationship-based programs, there's 2 major ways that I think we could really improve youth mentoring. And one is that we can train mentors to support, not deliver, but support technology-delivered interventions like Khan Academy, like Headspace, but even more so, like the universe of evidence-based apps that are constantly arriving, ones that treat cognitive behavioral, use cognitive behavioral treatments to deal with depression, anxiety. They're having effects that are out of this world. Like, now that I've taught you about effect sizes, like 0.6, 0.7, and in a very quick time, there's ones for social emotional learning. There's ones for, whatever. And so the idea is that you would kind of figure out what is the challenge the young person's working on, what are their strengths, and then tailor the intervention with the world's best education and mental health and career, or whatever it is they're working on, financial literacy, you name it, applying to college, whatever it is, there is an app for that. And not just an app, there's evidence-based apps for that. And instead of having the mentor deliver those complicated interventions, they just make sure that the young person engages. The second thing, and there's lots of good examples of this, is to take the mentors, the volunteers, and embed them in the systems that are already providing evidence-based care. Many schools are providing, social emotional learning training, yet, teachers are often pressed and they have to go quickly from one lesson to the next. Mentors could reinforce those evidence-based skills that they're learning with supervised practice, with talking about it, with kind of personalizing it for the young person. Boston Partners in Education has a great program where mentors are embedded in the classroom, and the mentor learns what the student is missing and then teaches that to them. Or you embed them in the juvenile justice system or the foster care system or whatever system that they are in. And we're moving from delivery to support. So let's go a little deeper into this idea for a moment. I'm going to talk about some of the benefits of these technology-delivered interventions. And I remember when I kind of came across this literature, there was a very big kind of social justice, educational justice component to it, because they were saying this is a way to bring technology-delivered interventions and bridge the gaps in services. And so there's a whole global mental health movement going on right now that is trying to harness the power of technology-delivered interventions. And the reason kids like them often is because of some of the reasons I list here. I will say that my book was almost done. I stumbled upon these ideas and it took me another 6 months. So this slide represents a lot of research into the many benefits of these, like data analysis, machine learning. Like we're able to capture a lot. They're marginal to scale, whether you're doing this intervention for one kid or for 1 million kids. And a lot of them are free because they're developed with funding from the National Institute of Mental Health or Department of Education or Department of Justice, and there's lots of career ones, and Khan Academy is free and so forth. There are a lot of them you can switch the language and have linguistic adaptations, and you can move beyond just having the fixed 1-year relationship to things moving more quickly. Now that's all great, except for one major problem. Engaging young people in apps other than, TikTok or Facebook or whatever has proven to be very difficult. Self-improvement apps have very low use. In the absence of support, less than 5% of young people reopen the app after they install it, even when a teacher recommends it or a mental health professional or a guidance counselor represents it. So this has been a real hand wringer for people who are, really throwing their hearts and souls into developing these great apps and web-based platforms. And there's a guy out at Northwestern, David Moore, who's come up, he and his colleagues have come up with this notion of supportive accountability. And they argue that human support increases adherence through accountability to a coach. And now think about mentoring, think about the light bulb going off in my head, who is trustworthy, benevolent, and having expertise. So what I think is that mentors can provide that supportive accountability. And we're hearing more and more, particularly during COVID, that teachers are spending half their time trying to get young people engaged in their classwork. Mentors can be that person who improves engagement. So when supplemented with coaching and opportunities to practice, technology-delivered interventions can produce outcomes that rival those of face-to-face interventions, often at no cost and in ways that are more geographically, financially, and socially acceptable. Now, bear in mind, this is not just the technology. This is technology plus a relationship, and not just a relationship that gets you to, that nudges you. It's a relationship where you care about the person and you want to be accountable to them. And so the bond is still front and center. So I would say that mentors were in need of evidence-based interventions, and that these technology-delivered tools were in need of mentors. And so my idea was, let's bring those together. And I've been working on that really ever since I finished writing the book about 6 months ago. And you can learn more about that at this website, mentorhubapp.org, where I'm working with Liz Raposa and Sam McQuillan and many others. And what we've done is we've gotten Khan Academy and Headspace and all of these apps to give us their API so that the mentor knows whether or not their mentee is using it and can nudge and issue badges and track their progress. And then the other one was this embedded mentoring model where, you know, we go to the places where young people are already learning or getting care and building skills, and we reinforce them. And that, I think, is great. So I'm going to end by saying that we have mentors and we wanted positive outcomes. And the way to do that is with different targeted evidence-based interventions. And that's how we can move the field forward. And I will end there, but I will end with just one other thing, and that is that's the first half of the book. The second half of the book is all about natural mentoring and the fourth type of mentoring. I said I was going to talk about, you know, what I called targeted or you know, specific mentoring programs, but also the blended, which is, you know, when you use technology, the embedded, where you put the mentor into the settings of the youth. And then the fourth one is youth initiated mentoring. And it's the idea that many young people really just need to be provided with skills for reaching out to the caring adults that are already in their lives. And that Sarah Schwartz and others have really developed the strategies for that as well. So now that I've said that, I would like to open it up for any questions, any reactions. This is more like a book talk than a, you know, research talk. And I really want to engage with you around these ideas.
Well, thank you, Jean. And yeah, I want to encourage folks, if you do pick up the book, there are dedicated chapters to kind of each of these paths forward that Jean kind of touched on here a little bit, and certainly we'll have time to go through, get a little deeper on some of those here in the next half hour. I do want to pause, and I know folks have been entering questions into the question panel, so I'm going to turn it over to Minnie here. Minnie, what's on people's minds? What questions do they have for Dr. Rhodes?
Yep, so we have one question here to start us off is, Jean, if you could talk more about what results were surprising to you from your book and anything that didn't surprise you?
Well, one of the things that I found so surprising was a result that Roger DeJora got when he asked mentors, what was the most common thing that you're doing with your mentee when you get together? And across, you know, 30 programs, over 2,000 matches, the most common thing was to make time to have fun. And the second most common thing was athletic or no, talking about people and ideas. And the third one was athletic events and sports. And the fourth one was hiking. And what I began to see is that really what mentoring programs were trying to be was more of a positive youth development program. And so then within that same report, which I urge all of you to download, it's available. You just type in DeJora technical report, and I can send Mike a link. It showed that 87% of the young people who had been referred to a mentoring program were already involved in a positive youth development program, and often more than one. Many of them were already in after-school programs, and they were actually getting pulled from those programs where they had daily, you know, contact with peers and staff to be with their mentor. So it was really duplicating something that they were already getting, making time to have fun. And yet, when you ask the parents and even the kids, they were really there for it because they had specific struggles that they were dealing with. So I'm not just sort of making this up. This is all coming from data. And that's really when I began to see, well, wait a minute. 91% of these young people in this study, you know, this kind of panorama of mentoring programs, 91% said they already had a great relationship with at least one teacher. Most of them were in sports. Most of them were getting those things. So why were we, you know, replicating those and then ignoring other things that they really needed? So that was what probably the most surprising thing, was really a deep dive into that report.
Great, thank you. We have another comment here from the audience. Rosie says, this business of accountability is profoundly underrated. I'm so glad to see the word being used. We hear so much about support and encouragement. People associate accountability with judgment and that it is a dirty word. Rosie would love to hear what you might think about this.
Yeah, so I kind of stumbled onto that finding as well when I was writing the book. You know, one of the beauties of having the center and having the liberty to just kind of go deep into the literature is I didn't know about this robust field of supportive accountability. And it's this notion that you don't have to be mean, you just have a goal. Like, why are we having this relationship if there isn't a goal? And let's keep that goal in mind, and then let's be accountable. And so what the researchers who have studied supportive accountability for years have found is that when people aren't following, the program, like whether it's in person or whatever, when they're not working toward their goals, there's common reasons. Maybe they think it's not a valuable goal, or maybe they don't understand the lesson, or maybe they're having trouble getting started. And so what supportive accountability experts do is they try to pinpoint what they call the pain or failure points and really help. So it's not just vaguely saying, did you do it? Did you do it? And there's actually research that shows that it's not really a bell curve, that if you're too nudgy, that can be a problem. So it's really, there is a science to being accountable. And I think that, Rosie, as you say, it gets kind of conflated with judgment, but at the core of it all, there needs to be a strong relationship. But I think we move from the word, friendship or relationship to the word alliance, because in the field of child and adolescent therapy, we don't talk about the relationship, we talk about the working alliance, because the assumption is that you're working on something, that, these two people are together to work on something. It's such a luxury to have a dedicated adult who's willing to give up time. Let's work on something. And so there's a researcher down at University of South Florida who I've had a lot of contact with, and in fact, we've built a course where we're shifting from a focus on building a relationship to focus on building a working alliance. And he has been studying that for 15 years. He's done meta-analyses on what are the components of a working alliance. And I have that through the center. I have that online training in supportive accountability, and also an online training in working alliance. So yeah, there's a deep science there that I think the field of mentoring would do well to benefit from.
Thank you. And another question we have from Amy is, how do you define and determine successful outcomes? What criteria do you use?
How do I define successful outcomes? And that's something that Mike has also touched on in one of the questions that he teed up for me. And that is that one of the reasons we get, low effects is because we haven't really been defining, if you've got this program, what are you expecting? And so, if you're using Headspace, for example, or you're teaching a young person STEM skills or whatever it is, you should be measuring that outcome, not just throwing a whole bunch of outcomes at them, because by definition, really, they're only going to be benefiting on the thing that they were taught. Now, one of the problems with doing that kind of evaluation that Sam McQuillan and Mike Lyons have pointed out is that programs don't always document what the inputs are. So, for example, we don't know what a mentor or mentee have been spending the hour or even the year doing. So it's hard to know what outcome to measure. Have they been working on this or that? What he found is that the vast majority of programs aren't documenting what it is they're doing together. And it's like saying, well, how can we fix it? If you were just making a cake and you just threw random ingredients in, how would you know how to fix it? So it's only by measuring what goes into it that you can tweak around and make it better.
Thank you so much, Jean. We have another question regarding the application. So
Yes.
Osama would love to know, what is tech doing to really unify the idea of technology and a relationship, especially during our physically distant mentoring spaces? For example, have applications like Duolingo, Headspace incorporated the ability for remote mentors to access the same application or account and view or monitor their mentees' progress from afar, yet in live time?
Mike, I promise you I did not tee up that question, but that's exactly what we saw a need for. So there are potential to, get a little bit of help within these apps, but nothing that cuts across apps. And so what we tried to create, me and Sam McQuillan and Liz Raposa and others, was a central place where mentors could connect to whatever app the young person is using through something called shared API, which is basically the app is connected to my app, and I can see every time my mentee logs in to Headspace. So I don't have to constantly say, did you log in? And I can see how long and what lesson they were on. And then I can provide supportive accountability that's really tailored to their use patterns. And so over the past year, and I promise you, I didn't have a crystal ball when I began doing this. This was long before COVID. I began to see a need for a mentoring supportive accountability app that was linked to best-in-class education and well-being and career and job skills development apps. And so that's what we've done. We've linked to many, many apps, and it provides a platform for supportive accountability across all of them. It's called mentorhubapp.org, and it's free to programs. So I'm not, this isn't an infomercial, I promise.
Thank you, Jean. And I think we have time for one more question, actually related to supportive accountability. Angela's wondering if you would be able to give an example of supportive accountability outside of just using an app. I'm not hearing other suggestions for activities except using an app. How do you recommend supportive accountability in other activities, such as sports and arts?
Yeah, so, you know, depending on what the goal is. So the first thing you have to understand is, what is your goal? What is your roadmap? And it may be that I want to get more exercise, or that I want to learn a second language, or that I want to apply for college. And so you find a program that is really good at those things. It doesn't have to be a tech program, but you kind of get your young person engaged in that. There's some really good workforce development programs, and then you make sure that the young person actually sticks with the goals as set forth in that program. And it could be more informal. It could be, I really want to apply to college this fall. Well, have you done this? Like, let's break it down together. The first thing you need to do is find out, what financial aid is there. And so you break down the steps, and then you provide that accountability that they're actually within, if you set a small goal, that they're going to accomplish that goal. So I think we can all provide supportive accountability, whether it's tech or in person.
Great, thank you, Jean. And I do want to move on a little bit here. We're going to do a little bit of kind of focused Q&A here on my end with Jean, and we will stop again with about 10 minutes before the top of the hour and take some more questions from our group here. I noticed, Amy, you noted in the question panel some suggestions for the types of outcomes that programs might want to be looking at long-term, things like graduation rates, avoiding juvenile justice involvement, those types of things. And Jean, I think that's another interesting wrinkle in this conversation about effects and effect size, right? Which is that often, there are sleeper effects, I think, for mentoring programs, right? Sometimes we ask, these young people immediately at the end of their relationship, did you improve in these things? And are you a different person than you were before having a mentor? And sometimes when you're 14 or whatever, you don't know, right? It's not until you get into your 20s, 30s, and you realize, oh, that advice I was being given, or these values that I was being kind of taught, they didn't really come into play, or I didn't know they were having an impact on me until I got into my adult years and had to make some decisions on my own. And so I think there's an interesting wrinkle here too around shorter term effects. And I think you're right in that these evidence-based interventions are often able to produce really good results pretty quickly, weeks and months. But I think there's also this longer term impact of mentoring that's still a bit unknown. We don't have great longitudinal research on some of this. So I just wanted to honor that comment by Amy.
Can I speak to it as well, though?
Sure, go for it.
I agree that there are probably sleeper effects to these, the very best of the kind of friendship-oriented multi-year relationships, what are considered the traditional benchmarks of success in these relationships. And in fact, Raj Chetty's student, he's an economist, has found some of these long-term sleeper effects. I think one of them was a greater likelihood of applying to college. And so I think that absolutely, Mike, there is a argument to be made that we need to kind of cast it out longer. However, I'll also say a few other things, and that is that when we look at any intervention, mentoring is no exception, we tend to see a erosion of effects over time. So if you look at it, at 12 months, right, immediately after the program, it's the strongest. Then at 6 months, it's weaker. And then a year later, it's even weaker. And that has been universal, not just for mentoring, but for many kind of second chance programs. And the idea is that we have to think of interventions not as like a one-time inoculation, but as a vitamin that you have to keep taking to derive the benefits of it. So if you can teach a young person through that one relationship that, hey, caring adults can be really helpful. Here's some skills so that you have someone like me that whenever you need one, then that is more like a vitamin. But I don't think a kind of unfocused relationship for 1 year for most kids is going to lead to relationships. I think those are the exceptions. And I think if you ask most parents and funders, would you rather know exactly what you're going to get in the short term in terms of improved social, emotional, academic, behavioral outcomes that could probably prevent progression to worse outcomes? Or do you want to hope that 30 years later you get one or two random effects? I think most people would pick the more immediate effects that could prevent progression to worse problems.
Yep, agreed. So I do want to take a minute here and dive deeper into a couple of themes that I thought were very pertinent in the book and kind of get some more insight from you here, Jean. I feel like you already answered this question around whether the way we evaluate mentoring programs is kind of fair. Are we looking at the right things? I will just note also in relation to Amy's comment that I see a lot of mentoring programs that are, have goals like, oh, graduation rates and, avoiding teen pregnancy. But I'm like, you're working with fourth graders, right? Like that's pretty far off from maybe focus on an outcome that's a little closer to where the work is actually happening. Is there anything else you'd like to say, though, about the way in which we evaluate programs, maybe skewing our results, either lower or higher than they might actually be, or are we just a little bit off target and maybe what we're looking for goals sometimes?
Yeah, I think that there's a danger sometimes when you throw out too wide a net and you don't have specific goals in mind of what are called type 2 errors. And that is that, sometimes you can just get effects randomly, either direction. So I think that the greater clarity you have in what it is you want and how you measure it, the more likely you are to have a real effect. And, I think that you're right. Sometimes we pick effects that are not that meaningful. For example, in the landmark study of Big Brothers Big Sisters, some of the big effects were drug use. But if you looked at the base rates, it was like less than 3% were even initiating drug use. So we were really looking at a very, kind of outlier behavior to begin with. And so you do need to pick meaningful indicators. And I would also, just because I have the platform, argue against kind of homegrown instruments. That there's a whole science to developing questionnaires and item response theory that I think we should, when possible, use questionnaires that have been tested. I would finally say that I think our major evaluation models right now are to give a pre-test and then wait a year or two, or usually a year, and then a post-test. And I think that's just too long a delay. And I think that there's better ways to do it that, new methods are coming up with where you get kind of random assessments along the way and you get more immediate data. So.
Good thoughts as always, Jean. And to your point about using validated tools when you're looking for outcomes, our National Mentoring Resource Center project does have a measurement guidance toolkit that provides at least our selections for what we consider to be really good survey questions and scales on a wide variety of outcomes that, I think speak to most mentoring programs and what they're trying to accomplish. So if you're looking for an easy source of validated instruments to use in your evaluation, that toolkit is an excellent resource, and everything that's on there is downloadable and free to use. And so that's the type of thing that I think will make that a little easier for practitioners. I wanted to ask you, just because the last 7 months we've all been swimming in a virus condition here. How has this pandemic influenced your thinking about this? You wrote this book, I think, largely before all of this happened. Is it more important than ever to shift our focus of our mentoring work to perhaps addressing some of these mental health needs a little bit more directly? Or is it the opposite, and that because things are so weird and kind of scary right now that young people just need all the support they can get, and this kind of targeted emphasis maybe isn't needed right now? What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I think that's a really universal question probably everybody who's listening to this is wondering, and I certainly don't have the answers, but I have a few thoughts about it. And one is that even before the pandemic, I had embraced that the mentoring field would benefit from taking more advantage of technology delivered interventions, because they're getting so good. I don't know a single clinical child psychologist who isn't trying to put their intervention online in some way, shape, or form, and that enables us to deliver them. So that was something that I had presented to Big Brothers Big Sisters of America a year ago, and they had embraced, and we're moving in that direction, as was other programs. So in that way, the advised mentoring approach hasn't changed much, although face-to-face is, the opportunity to build that relationship and build the opportunities for practicing. So that is something we need to return to. But more generally, I think we need to recognize, and probably most of us do, that young people are, particularly more marginalized ones, derive a lot of their mental health care, a lot of their non-parent adult support from schools. In fact, the vast majority of young people who ever receive mental health care receive it from the nurses, counselors, social workers, and even teachers at their schools. At the same time, they're cut off from the coaches, the after-school staff, and the other caring adults, even extended relatives. So we're talking about really a major loss of caring adults. And so it really does highlight the need for volunteers to step up in whatever way they can. And, there are ways to do it over technology and over Zoom, and really begin to kind of fill in those gaps. Because what we're seeing when you read reports, there's, this COVID academic slide, which is going to be much worse and lead to even bigger inequalities in educational trajectories for particularly low-income Black and Latinx students. We're seeing the worst outcomes, and we're expecting them to really lose almost a year of school so far. And also the mental health slides. I mean, many are being, if you read the columns in my Chronicle, as well as columns on the Mentor website, there's lots that's being talked about of the mental health crisis, of trauma, of depression, of severe anxiety, of insomnia, and other things. And so now is the time to reach out and to really be that advocate for young people. And I know programs are suffering because, they rely on events for fundraising, they rely on face-to-face. And so, I also need to honor and recognize that this COVID is affecting programs as much as everybody else.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's one of the tough things for our field, is trying to figure out how we can, even ramp up our efforts even more at a time when our staff and our resources are also taking a hit.
Yes.
I also wanted to ask you about another aspect of, kind of tying your book to maybe some things that are top of mind right now. And I know that over the past, 5 or 6 months, many mentoring programs are rethinking or thinking more deeply about the ways in which their work hopefully supports racial justice and ideally directly confronts issues that impact communities that we're serving, issues like police brutality, systemic racism, all kinds, myriad issues, unfortunately, that the country is facing. And I'm just curious how the ideas in your book fit into themes of social justice, equity, equality. What are your thoughts on that, Jean?
Well, I think that we should start with formal mentoring, and then I want to talk about how it touches on the second half of the book, which is kind of more natural mentoring. So formal mentoring, there is a valid critique that just zeroing in on challenges without addressing the wider context can be problematic, because it sends the message that whatever you're suffering, anxiety, depression, has nothing to do with what's going on around you. It's about you. And so it's very important, as we work on these things, for mentors to acknowledge the real stressors and the real circumstances that may be giving rise to them. Having said that, just because there's real stressors doesn't mean we shouldn't work on them. Catching things early and teaching young people social emotional skills can become a real protective factor, and can keep things, just teaching math to somebody that's failing in one class can prevent an academic slide that could, redact for generations. And so I think there's both keeping that broader context in mind, and acknowledging it, but also working on the real things that young people are coming for is a way of honoring the suffering and help and being constructive. And it's not just talking about them. It's saying, yes, those things exist, but let's also work on what we can do right now. I also think that there's a social justice piece to connecting middle class, more privileged adults with the young people that we see being referred to these programs. I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt who said that, it's impossible to be sympathetic to children in the abstract. It's only when you get to know one child that you become an informed advocate for all children. And I believe that mentoring provides one of the most sanctioned ways for us to cross these class, race, other barriers, religious barriers, and really get inside people, unlike ourselves and unlike the typical middle class mentor. And so I think that we need to really maybe find ways to kind of get mentors to reflect on that, because once they become more engaged and informed citizens, they become supporters of the kinds of policies that would help families that are most vulnerable. So that's what I'll say about formal mentoring. Do you want to react to that at all before I move on, Mike?
Oh, we've done some work at Mentor, some research kind of showing that folks who were already mentoring a young person reported being much more concerned about issues related to children. They were more invested in things like, the education system, thought more highly of our schools, and also thought more highly of the parents of young people in mentoring programs. And so I don't know if there's a chicken or egg thing there. Did they already feel that way and that's why they volunteered, or was it the result of their volunteering? But I do know at Mentor, we do a lot of work to try and get people not only to step up to be mentors to kids, but then build on that by becoming an advocate, talking to their political representatives about the need to fund this work and build systems and do that change too. So.
And really, it was one of your reports, Mike, that really gave me some great insights. That's kind of survey of American volunteer adults. And one of the things that became clear is that it's not a political issue. As you recall, there was probably the most active volunteers were what Sam McQuillan entitled conflicted conservatives, but people who really, or conflicted believers, I forget what it was, but people who believed in social justice, but also had very strong religious values and conservative political values. And so I think mentoring is one of those few things on which we can all agree, in a world where there's just so much partisanship. We have a moment here where we unify around this. So now I'm going to shift to natural mentoring, because one of the things that's so interesting to me is that only 4% or 5% of young people will ever have a formal mentor. I mean, maybe we can improve it a percentage or two, but it's been stuck around that for quite a long time, despite all sorts of efforts to mobilize volunteers. It goes up or down a few percentage points. However, over 70% of young people say they have a natural mentor. And this is coming from a large survey of 60,000 American youth, the Ad Health survey, as well as smaller surveys. It seems to be around 70% of young people. If you ask them, is there a caring adult in your life? And you give them all the definitions, they'll say yes. So you could take that to say, well, young people are perfectly adept at recruiting their own mentors, natural mentors. So why do we need to get involved there? Well, if you look carefully, which my student Matt Hagler and other students have done, is we see that natural mentoring tends to reproduce inequality. And what I mean by that is there's different kinds of natural mentors. So we looked at it across race and class and privilege, and we find that more privileged young people tend to have mentors who are better able to connect them with opportunities. It's sometimes called weak ties, but they're people who can say, all right, I know about a summer internship, or I can help you get into college, or whatever it is. The most marginalized young people have mentors, statistically fewer mentors, but still over 60% of them say they have a mentor. But those mentors tend to be people who cannot as easily connect them to opportunities, extended family members, and older siblings. It's not to say that those aren't valuable connections, but what they're doing is they're not finding mentors in their schools and in their after-school programs. and other adults that could, their sports programs that could connect them to opportunities. And so what we find in these studies is that more privileged kids are much more likely to say that their mentor helped them get jobs, that they see their mentor as a role model, than less privileged kids say about their mentors. So that tells us that we need to do two things. We need to teach young people that they are entitled, all young people are entitled to caring adults. That it's, we wrote an article, Sarah Schwartz and I, it's called I Didn't Know You Could Just Ask. And what was so striking to us working with more marginalized young people was that they really didn't have the sense that it was okay to reach out to somebody outside their family for care and support. So that those skills can be taught. And over the past decade, Sarah Schwartz has really refined how to teach youth-initiated mentoring. And we just ran a meta-analysis, the first ever, on youth-initiated mentoring, and we got some very nice effects for it. But it also says we need to stock those ponds. You can't just teach someone to fish if their school has one teacher for every 45 kids and not enough guidance counselors and not enough coaches and not even enough extracurricular activities. And so we need to do, the path to social justice around caring adults is to provide more caring adults within those systems.
Agreed. Jean. Minnie, I know I had more questions for Jean here, but I want to honor the audience. I see they've been typing in some great questions. I think we've got time for one or two here. So why don't you let us know what's top of mind for folks?
Just a couple questions. I think some folks just didn't catch. What was the name of the toolkit you mentioned earlier?
Oh, the Mentor Hub app. mentorhubapp.org.
And many, if they were referring to the measurement guidance toolkit that I mentioned, where those evaluation instruments are available, that's the name of it is Measurement Guidance Toolkit. If you just Google that, you'll find it, but it's on our National Mentoring Resource Center website. So if you go to, it's a long URL, nationalmentoringresourcecenter.org, you'll find it there.
Great, thank you both. I think we just got a bunch of questions, I think, and comments. Sorry, a bunch of comments. Being glad that we asked the question about justice. So just thanking you. I know Rosie asked the earlier question, and now Rosie has another comment, I think, in response to your response, Dr. Rhodes, about the apps and using kind of apps as a way to kind of connect with young people. Rosie says that they're skeptical about apps being the vessel through which we are going to assert our interventions. Rosie suggests this book called If Then by Jill Lepore. She makes the case for all of us to be suspicious paying for using technology to manipulate us.
Okay, well, I don't think I've read Jill's book and it's fantastic. Everything she writes is great, but she's not referring to things like Khan Academy as much as, a lot of social media and things like that.
Yeah, and it's somebody who trends a little bit older than I'd like to be. I think mentoring at its heart is something that is probably best delivered, in person. I think even sort of accountability role, I think, is hard to do remotely, but it can be done, right? I mean, there are plenty of folks that do coaching and keep people on, say, a treatment plan. I know this idea of supportive accountability is big in like telemedicine, where you have check-ins with a nurse practitioner to make sure that you're taking your medications or doing your exercises or whatever it is you have as a treatment plan. And so I do think technology can play a role in all of that. The quality of any given app is dependent upon the people who have put it together and what it's trying to accomplish. And to your point, Jean, whether it's based on evidence-based practices within a field. So wide variety and quality, I would assume, amongst apps, but there are good ones.
I do want to end by saying that's not the only solution. There's lots of different solutions. And at the heart of all of this, as you said, Mike, is the relationship. That is the sine qua non. And I think there is a science to building these kinds of helpful relationships. And it doesn't happen just randomly in many cases. And so I think that if we're going to be scientific, we have to be scientific about what our interventions are, but we also have to be scientific about how we go about building really good, helpful relationships with young people.
Yep. And Rosie, I just wanted to respond. I saw your comment in the question panel here around the racial dynamics of our field, and a lot of white volunteers mentoring young people of color. And I think one of the things that I always try and make clear in my work is that when we provide a mentor to a young person through a program, no matter who that person is, and I agree with you that we do have disparity around that, that we cannot make the implication that that young person does not already have mentors in their life, right? And mentors that are in their community, mentors that are in their extended family and kinship networks and in their neighborhoods. That's one of the worst things that I've seen historically about our field. I think we're getting better at it, but you know, there's this implication that you don't have mentors or adult guidance until you get handed this person who probably doesn't live anywhere near you or look anything like you through a program, right? And I think that's a false assumption, and it's horribly paternalistic, and I feel our field moving away from that during this time, but I think we still have work to do to make that you know, less of an issue. So.
And it's also a case for youth-initiated mentoring, because when young people are left to find their own mentors and then programs support those, they typically find people from the same race and class. So.
Yeah. So I know we are at time today, so I want to wrap and just make sure we don't bleed into people's afternoons and lunch hours here. But Jean, where can folks find the book if they're interested in picking up a copy?
Well, they can find it. What I can do, Mike, is give you a link for a discounted copy of it that people can use, which is what I did with Mentor Canada yesterday, or you can go to Amazon.
Okay, great. And we'll share that link to the discount copies when we send around the recording and slides from today. Jean mentioned this a couple of times, the Chronicle of Evidence-Based Mentoring, her awesome website that breaks down kind of new and emerging research. You can find even more research summaries and kind of research to practice information on the National Mentoring Resource Center site that I mentioned earlier. And because we talked about coronavirus and just all the chaos that our field is trying to work its way through because of the pandemic, I just wanted to note that there is a good selection of resources around coronavirus and how it's impacting our field on the Mentor website. Any final thoughts before we wrap up, Jean?
No, but just a huge thank you to everyone. You know, it's just such an honor to have this platform and to talk with you all. I just wish I could have seen you in person, but hopefully soon.
Yes, hopefully soon. So thank you for joining us today on behalf of Mentor and Dr. Rhodes. Wishing all of you good health, especially, and good mentoring as well. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you on a webinar soon. Thanks, everyone.